When my father passed away after a long, painful battle with cancer, it felt like my world was crumbling. My dad had always been my protector, my guide in life. Watching him slip away over those agonizing months was unbearable, but I tried to find some comfort in the belief that, at least now, he was no longer suffering. My mom, on the other hand, was strangely detached during his illness. I thought it was her way of coping, that maybe she just couldn't handle seeing him so weak. But barely a week after the funeral, I came home to something I never expected. A man I had never met was sitting in my dad's chair. That chair had been his favorite spot for years, where he'd relax after a long day, read, or just talk with me. Seeing someone else, there was like a punch to the gut. My mom casually introduced the man as Tom, her new partner. I stood there, stunned, unable to process how she could move on so fast. The house still smelled like my dad, yet here she was already with someone new. I confronted her, still reeling from the shock. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Dad just died, and you're already with someone else?" She didn't even blink. Her voice was cold, unbothered. "I've been seeing Tom for a while, long before your father passed. He knew about us, and honestly, it's none of your business." I couldn't believe it. Since before Dad got sick? How could you? I shouted, my voice cracking with disbelief and anger. But she just shrugged, her indifference cutting deeper than any words she could have said. "I deserve to move on, to be happy," she said, her tone growing sharp. "I'm not going to let the past drag me down anymore. I don't need reminders of him around here." Then she did the unthinkable. She started tossing out my dad's belongings, his clothes, his tools, even his old journals and letters. My dad's entire life, all the things that were pieces of him, discarded as if they meant nothing. I scrambled to save what I could, grabbing a few mementos before she pushed me out of the way. But she wasn't done yet. "You need to pack your things and leave too," she said coldly. "I don't want any of your father's filth lingering here. It's time to move on, and that includes you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't just moving on from Dad. She was erasing him from our lives completely. And now, she was erasing me too. After that gut-wrenching conversation, things went from bad to worse. My mom wasn't just throwing away my dad's belongings. She was throwing me out too. It wasn't enough for her to erase him from our lives. Now she wanted to erase me, like I was some kind of reminder she couldn't bear to have around. Tom, always hovering nearby, didn't hide his satisfaction. I was the last piece of my dad left in the house, and they were determined to get rid of me. One morning, I came downstairs to find all of my stuff packed in boxes. My clothes, books, personal things, all stacked neatly by the front door. My mom was standing in the living room with Tom behind her, his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. I felt like I had walked into some kind of nightmare. "We think it's time for you to move out," she said, her voice cold and businesslike, like this was just another chore to check off her list. "Move out?" I stared at her, barely able to process what she was saying. "You're kicking me out?" "I've got nowhere to go, Mom." But she didn't care. She didn't even flinch. "You'll figure it out," she said dismissively, her eyes hard. "I don't need any more of your father's reminders hanging around this house. You need to grow up and learn to stand on your own 2 feet. The words stung more than I could have imagined. I was still reeling from my dad's death, and now I was losing my home too? I glanced at Tom, who had the audacity to smirk as if this was some kind of game. I couldn't believe my mom was doing this. The woman who should have been my rock after my dad's death was now the one tearing my life apart. And for what? So she could move on with her new partner without any baggage from the past? I asked her where she expected me to go. Her response was cold and dismissive. "You're an adult. You'll figure it out." She didn't offer a single word of support, not even a hint of sympathy. No offer of help to find a place or money to get on my feet. It was like I was a stranger to her now. My own mother, completely indifferent to my pain, my grief, everything. I packed the rest of my things in stunned silence. I could barely breathe as I loaded my car, knowing I was driving away from everything I knew. I called my best friend, barely holding it together, and they told me I could crash at their place for a while. They were a lifeline in that moment when everything else had fallen apart. That night, as I lay on their couch, staring at the ceiling, I felt hollow. Homeless, fatherless, betrayed by the one person I thought I could count on. My world had turned upside down, and I had no idea what to do next. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let my mom and Tom destroy everything. Not without a fight. Crashing on my friend's couch wasn't easy, but it gave me time to reflect. Every night, I lay awake, thinking about what had happened. How could my mom, the person who should have been grieving with me, be so callous? How could she move on so fast and kick me out like I didn't matter? My mind kept circling back to my dad. He was always organized, always careful with things like finances and legal matters. One night, it hit me. Something wasn't adding up. My dad would have made sure things were taken care of before he passed. He had always been meticulous about his estate. I started wondering if there was more to the situation than I realized, so I decided to visit my dad's lawyer, Mr. Hensley. When I arrived at his office, I wasn't sure what to expect. Mr. Hensley had been my dad's lawyer for years, but I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. I explained what had happened with my mom and how she threw me out of the house. He listened carefully, his brow furrowed as I spoke. "You know your father was very thorough," he said, pulling out a file. "He left everything in order." He handed me a stack of documents, including my dad's will. As I started reading, I felt my heart skip a beat. According to the will, the house, the same house my mom had kicked me out of, had been left to me. It was mine. Legally, my mom had no right to throw me out, and Tom certainly had no claim to it either. I sat there, stunned. All this time, I thought my mom was the one in control, but the truth was she had no legal ground to stand on. She either didn't know about the will, or worse, she knew and had hoped I wouldn't figure it out. Mr. Hensley saw the shock on my face. "Your father wanted to make sure you were taken care of," he said gently. "He knew how much that house meant to you." I didn't know what to feel: betrayal, anger, confusion. But one thing was crystal clear. My mom had lied to me, and she had no right to throw me out of my own home. Everything she had done since my dad's death was built on lies. As I left the lawyer's office, the reality of the situation hit me hard. I had to confront her. But this time, I wasn't going to let her manipulate me. I wasn't just fighting for the house. I was fighting for everything my dad had worked so hard to protect for me. Walking back into the house, I felt an unfamiliar surge of confidence, clutching the documents like a shield. This time, things were different. Tom was sprawled out on the couch like he owned the place, a beer in hand, flipping through channels without a care in the world. The sight of him lounging in my father's home, my asterisk home, boiled my blood. My mom was in the kitchen, humming to herself like nothing was wrong. But the second she saw the papers in my hand, her face paled. Her confidence, the same smug assurance she'd had when she threw me out, faltered. She knew something was coming. I slammed the papers on the table, the sound loud enough to make both of them jump. "This house is mine," I said, my voice steady but seething. "Dad left it to me." At first, my mom tried to wave it off. She glanced at the papers, but didn't really look. "You don't understand how these things work," she said, her voice dismissive. "It's more complicated than that." But her words didn't have the same sting they used to. She wasn't in control anymore. "I've spoken to Dad's lawyer," I said, cutting through her lies. "This isn't complicated. The will is clear. This house belongs to me. And you and Tom need to leave." Tom shifted uncomfortably, still silent, but shooting me a glare like I'd just ruined his whole plan. Maybe I had. He wasn't as vocal as my mom, but the disdain was clear on his face. This man, who had been a stranger to me just weeks ago, had gotten comfortable far too quickly in my dad's chair, in my dad's space. My mom's expression turned desperate. "You can't do this," she pleaded, her tone softening, trying to get through to me. "I'm your mother, and I'm just trying to move on with my life. Don't take that away from me." "Move on?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You're not just moving on, you're erasing Dad. You threw out all of his things, threw me out, and replaced us both with him." I pointed at Tom, who was still fuming in silence. "You don't care about moving on. You just don't want to face what you did." Her eyes welled up, but it wasn't with remorse, it was panic. She was realizing she might actually lose. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "We don't need to make this ugly. You're hurting, I get that. But we can work this out. Just don't make me leave." I shook my head. "You had a choice when you threw me out. You didn't care then, so why should I care now? You didn't respect Dad or his memory. Now, you have to face the consequences." Her face hardened when she realized begging wasn't going to work. She turned cold. "You really want to do this? You want to kick your own mother out? Do you think your father would be proud of that?" The mention of my dad stung, but I wasn't backing down. Dad would be proud of me for standing up for what's right. He left this house to me for a reason. Tom finally spoke, his voice dripping with disdain. "We'll see about that. Maybe we'll contest the will. You think it's that easy to get rid of us?" I didn't flinch. "Go ahead and try," I shot back, walking out of the room. "But you'd better pack your bags in the meantime." As I left the house that day, I knew the battle wasn't over. My mom and Tom would try to fight this, but I had the truth and my father's will. on my side. They could contest all they wanted. I wasn't giving up without a fight. The moment my mom refused to move out and threatened to contest the will, I knew I was in for a long, ugly fight. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up for my father's memory and not letting my mother erase everything he had left behind. She had thrown me out like I meant nothing, and now she was ready to do the same with my dad's wishes. I quickly realized this wasn't going to be a simple eviction. My mom had already hired a high-powered attorney, funded by Tom. It made my blood boil to think that the man who had slithered into our lives while my dad was still sick was now bankrolling a lawsuit against me, using every dirty trick in the book to help my mom keep the house. I sat down with my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn who had a reputation for being tough as nails in court. "We have the will, the deeds, and the law on our side," she said confidently. "But they're going to make this personal. Be prepared for them to attack your character." Sure enough, that's exactly what happened when we got to court. My mom's lawyer painted a picture of me as a selfish, ungrateful son, someone who was trying to take advantage of my grieving mother. He twisted every piece of evidence to fit their narrative, making it seem like I was the villain in all of this. I sat there, watching my mom on the witness stand, lying through her teeth about how much she had sacrificed for me, how she had been there for my dad during his illness. It was sickening. The truth was that she had emotionally checked out long before my dad passed away, and now she was trying to rewrite history to suit her agenda. Tom sat smugly behind her, knowing he had nothing to lose and everything to gain if they won. But Evelyn wasn't going to let them get away with it. She cross-examined my mom with laser precision, pulling out bank statements and financial records that proved I had been supporting myself long before my dad passed away. She reminded the court that I had been the one caring for my dad, not my mom, and that my father had intentionally left the house to me because he trusted me to honor his memory. The battle was fierce. Every time I thought we had the upper hand, my mom's lawyer would twist something or present some new evidence that made me look like the bad guy. But we had one thing they didn't: my dad's will. The will was rock solid, and despite all their efforts to undermine it, there was no denying that my dad had left the house to me, and me alone. Still, the stress was overwhelming. The case dragged on for weeks, and every day felt like a new blow to my mental and emotional health. My mom wasn't just trying to win the house. She was trying to break me. Every time I walked into that courtroom, I had to face her cold, calculating gaze, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. I kept reminding myself that I wasn't just fighting for the house. I was fighting for my dad's legacy, for everything he had worked for. I couldn't let my mom and Tom take that away from me. As the court proceedings continued, I could see that the case was starting to wear on my mom, too. The confident, smug attitude she had walked in with was beginning to crumble. It was clear she hadn't expected me to fight back this hard. And Tom? Well, his self-satisfied grin was slowly disappearing as the legal fees piled up and the case dragged on longer than either of them had anticipated. The battle wasn't over yet, but I could feel the tide starting to turn. We were getting closer to the truth and to justice. As the trial continued, the facade my mom had so carefully crafted began to unravel. It turned out, her relationship with Tom had gone back much further than I originally thought. She had been seeing him for years, even before my dad was diagnosed. I could barely process that level of betrayal. It wasn't just a moment of weakness after my dad got sick. It was a full-blown affair that had been going on while my dad was alive and fighting for his life. My lawyer, Evelyn, had anticipated that my mom would try to play the victim card, but the deeper we dug, the uglier the truth became. We found evidence that during the worst periods of my dad's illness, when I was the one taking care of him day in and day out, my mom had been sneaking away to spend time with Tom. She wasn't just moving on quickly after my dad's death. She had checked out of the marriage years before he even got sick. Evelyn didn't hold back during the next round of cross-examinations. She brought forward testimony from my dad's close friends, people who had seen him deteriorate physically and emotionally while my mom distanced herself. One of his closest friends, Greg, testified that my dad had known something was wrong but was too proud to confront her. It was devastating to hear, but it also validated what I had suspected for years. My mom had abandoned my dad long before his death, and now she was trying to steal the house he left to me. The judge sat quietly as we presented the evidence, but I could see the shift in his demeanor. My mom's claims were starting to crumble. She was no longer the grieving widow trying to protect her home. She was exposed for what she truly was, a woman who had betrayed her dying husband and was now desperately trying to hold onto a life built on lies. Tom was visibly uncomfortable as more details about their affair came to light. He had been all smiles and cocky confidence during the earlier parts of the trial, but now his arrogance was starting to falter. My mom, too, was losing her cool. Her polished exterior began to crack under the weight of Evelyn's relentless questioning, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to fight back this hard, or for the truth to come out in such a public way. During one heated cross-examination, Evelyn presented a key piece of evidence that shattered their last defense. A series of texts between Tom and my mom, sent while my dad was in the hospital during his final days. In those messages, they talked about their plans to move in together as soon as my dad passed. They spoke about finally being free and not having to hide anymore. It was a punch to the gut, but it was also the nail in the coffin for their case. The judge reviewed the messages, his expression grim. My mom's lawyer tried to spin it, but there was no defending this. The court could see that her contest of the will wasn't about fairness or grieving. It was about greed. The tide was fully turning in my favor, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. My mom had tried to erase my dad's memory, to rewrite the history of our family for her own benefit, but the truth was finally out in the open. She couldn't hide behind her lies any longer. As the proceedings continued, I found myself growing more confident. I wasn't just fighting for the house anymore. I was fighting for my father's legacy, for everything he had worked for. Every piece of evidence we presented, every witness we called, brought me one step closer to justice. By the time we wrapped up that day in court, it was clear that the judge was seeing through their manipulation. My mom's lies were exposed, and the narrative they had tried to spin was falling apart at the seams. I left the courthouse that day feeling a sense of vindication I hadn't felt in a long time. The truth was finally coming to light, and the house that my father had willed to me, his legacy, was one step closer to being mine again. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Finally, after weeks of legal back and forth, sleepless nights, and constant stress, the day I had been waiting for arrived, the day of the verdict. I walked into the courtroom, heart pounding, knowing that whatever happened, this would determine the future of my life and my father's legacy. The judge took his seat, the air in the room thick with tension. My mom sat across from me, avoiding my eyes, her expression unreadable. Tom wasn't there. He hadn't been for the last few days of the trial. I think even he realized that their charade had crumbled beyond repair. The judge began speaking, his voice steady as he recounted the facts of the case. My lawyer, Evelyn, had built such a strong case that I had begun to feel cautiously optimistic, but that didn't ease the anxiety I felt in this moment. The room was eerily silent as the judge looked directly at my mother. After reviewing the evidence and considering the clear intentions of the will left by the deceased, it is the court's decision that the house and all associated property rightfully belongs to the defendant, as per his father's last will and testament. Those words hit me like a wave of relief. My shoulders sagged as I realized it was over. The judge continued, laying out the terms. My mom and Tom had 1 month to vacate the property, and they were to compensate me for any items of my father's that had been thrown out or destroyed. I could barely process it all. The house was mine, just like my father had intended. My mother sat there, stone-faced, as if she hadn't just lost the battle she'd fought so ruthlessly to win. For a moment, I expected her to explode in fury, to cause a scene, but instead, she simply stared blankly at the judge, her composure cracking only slightly when the finality of the verdict hit her. When the court adjourned, I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months. My mom glanced at me, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she looked defeated. She didn't say a word as she gathered her things, but I could tell the reality was sinking in. She had lost. As I stepped outside the courthouse, I felt the weight of the entire battle lift from my shoulders. The fight was over. The house, my father's house, was mine, and my mom would no longer have the power to manipulate me or tarnish my dad's memory. Evelyn walked out with me, a satisfied smile on her face. "I told you we'd win," she said, offering a handshake. "Thank you," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." She gave me a reassuring nod. "You fought for what was right. Your dad would be proud." As I left the courthouse that day, I realized this wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming my life, my home, and my future. My father's legacy had been preserved, and I had done right by him. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt at peace. The house was safe, and I knew that I could finally start rebuilding my life on my terms. My mother and Tom would be out of my life soon, and I wouldn't have to look back. This chapter was closing, and a new one was about to begin. After the ruling, things moved faster than I had anticipated. My mom and Tom were given 1 month to vacate the house, but in reality, they were gone within 2 weeks. Maybe the humiliation of losing the legal battle pushed them to leave quicker. Still, the process wasn't without its final moments of desperation. A few days before they left, my mom approached me with one last plea. I was at the house, inspecting some of the damage caused during her attempt to erase my dad from our lives. The door creaked, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of regret and stubbornness. "Please, can we just talk?" she said quietly, her voice lacking the fight it once held. I stared at her, my emotions caught between exhaustion and a deep sense of betrayal. "What's left to say, Mom? You threw me out, tried to take everything that Dad left for me, and now you want to talk?" She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I know I made mistakes. I was grieving and confused. Tom helped me through a lot, but I shouldn't have done what I did. I just don't want to lose you too." I took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in, but the wounds were still too fresh. "Mom, you've lost me already. You made your choices, and I've made mine. I can't go back to how things were, and you need to leave." She tried again, her voice cracking with emotion. "This is still my home. No, it's not." I cut her off firmly. "This house was Dad's. He left it to me. You made your choices when you chose to erase him and move on with Tom. You've had months to fix this, but instead, you doubled down. Now, you have to deal with the consequences." For a moment, she just stood there, and I almost felt a flicker of sympathy. But I remembered the cruelty of her words when she kicked me out, calling my father's memory filth from the past. That was something I could never forget. Without another word, she left. The door clicked shut behind her, and I knew it was the last time we'd have that kind of conversation. When they were finally gone, I moved back into the house. The first few nights were strange. The house felt hollow, a shell of what it used to be when my father was still alive. I wandered from room to room, the silence deafening, memories hanging in the air like ghosts. Every corner of the house was a reminder of what had been lost, the family, the connection, and my dad's presence. But I couldn't live in the past. I decided the only way to move forward was to make the house my own. The house needed to change if I was going to heal. So I got to work. I started small, repainting the walls, rearranging furniture, replacing the old with the new. It wasn't just about making it look different. It was about creating something that reflected my life now, not the painful memories tied to my mom's betrayal. As the renovations progressed, the house slowly transformed. The rooms that once echoed with bad memories became brighter, warmer. I tore down the wallpaper my mom had put up after my dad's passing, a symbolic erasure of her attempt to control my life. But even with the renovations, the scars of what had happened still lingered. My mom's betrayal wasn't something I could fix with a new coat of paint. The trust was gone, and any hope of a reconciliation felt impossible. Yet, with each step forward, I was reclaiming what was mine, not just the house, but my life. I still thought of my dad often, especially when I was working on the house. I hoped that, wherever he was, he'd be proud of how I stood my ground and fought for what he left behind. Slowly but surely, I was moving forward, building a future that was finally my own. After losing the house, my mom's life seemed to spiral out of control. I wasn't actively keeping track of her, but in a town this small, news traveled fast. I heard bits and pieces from mutual acquaintances. Her relationship with Tom had crumbled almost immediately after the court's ruling. Apparently, without the house and the financial security she had assumed would come with it, Tom quickly lost interest and moved on. My mom tried to hang on, but she wasn't prepared for the life she now found herself living. The lavish lifestyle she had become accustomed to vanished overnight. She moved into a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. People who had once been close to her distanced themselves, no longer charmed by the version of her that Tom had helped present. She was struggling, emotionally, financially, and socially. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. A part of me felt the pull of guilt, as if I was somehow responsible for her situation. After all, I had taken the house, her last connection to the life she had built with my dad. But then I remembered the way she had treated me, the way she had tossed my father's memory aside as if it meant nothing. There were moments when I thought about reaching out, maybe to offer some kind of help, maybe just to talk. But every time I considered it, I remembered the betrayal too vividly. The cruel way she kicked me out of the house and the lengths she went to in order to erase my father from her life. The wound was still too fresh, too raw. I knew that letting her back in, even just for a conversation, would only risk reopening those scars. It was strange to think of her as vulnerable. My whole life, she had been this force of control and manipulation. But now, she was struggling, powerless in a way I never thought I'd see. Even the people who once sided with her during the court battle had stopped showing support, distancing themselves from the scandal she had created. The last I heard, she had been bouncing between part-time jobs and barely scraping by. There was something oddly poetic about it all. She had thrown away everything good in her life for a man like Tom, and now she was paying the price for that choice. In some ways, it was her own personal downfall, a slow unraveling of the life she had tried to rebuild at the expense of my father's legacy. Still, I couldn't fully bring myself to hate her. My feelings were complicated, tangled between years of resentment and the familial connection I couldn't entirely sever. But I also knew I had to protect myself. Allowing her back into my life would only bring chaos and pain. I'd already fought hard to reclaim my peace, and I wasn't about to jeopardize that for someone who had betrayed me so deeply. The more time passed, the more I realized that this was her path to walk alone. I couldn't fix her mistakes, and I wasn't going to be drawn into her world again. She had made her choices that had led to her losing not only the house, but also the respect and trust of those around her. Now, she had to live with the consequences. As for me, I was moving forward. My life was finally becoming something I could be proud of, free from the toxic influence of my mother and the past that once weighed me down. Now that the house is truly mine, it's no longer just a building filled with memories. It's become my sanctuary, my proof that I can rise above everything I've been through. Over the last few months, I've poured my energy into renovating it, giving it a fresh start just like I'm giving myself. Every room I repaint, every new piece of furniture I bring in, feels like another step forward, a way to reclaim what was once filled with so much pain and betrayal. I think about my dad often. There's not a day that goes by where I don't feel his presence in the walls of this house, the place where we shared so many moments. I like to believe that he's watching over me, proud of how I handled everything. I hope he knows that I fought for him, for the legacy he built, and for the life he wanted me to have. That thought keeps me grounded and gives me the strength to keep going. My mom and I haven't spoken since she left the house, and I don't know if we ever will again. It's strange to think about it. How someone who was once such a big part of my life has now faded into the background. But the truth is, I'm okay with it. Some relationships aren't meant to last, and I've come to accept that my mother was one of those people who wasn't capable of being what I needed her to be. The pain of her betrayal still stings when I think about it too much, but I've learned to live with it. I've also learned the power of letting go. Letting go of the people who hurt me, of the anger that consumed me for so long. There was a time when I thought I'd never be able to move on from the bitterness, but the more I rebuild my life, the more I realize that holding on to that resentment only holds me back. I'm choosing to focus on the people who have stood by me, my friends, my dad's old colleagues who still check in on me, and the new relationships I'm building. Life goes on, and despite everything, I'm finally finding peace. The house, once a place of turmoil, is now filled with warmth and light. I've turned it into a space where I can grow, where I can breathe, and where I can continue to heal. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means learning from it and carrying those lessons with you. My father taught me strength and perseverance, and those are the things that have carried me through this entire ordeal. I've learned how to stand up for myself, how to fight for what I believe in, and how to protect the things that matter most to me. As I sit here, looking out over the garden my dad and I planted together years ago, I know that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. The future feels uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it. I've been through the worst, and I've come out the other side stronger, more sure of myself, and ready for whatever comes next. In the end, I didn't just win a legal battle, I won back my life. And that's a victory I'll carry with me forever.